Usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of absolute precision. Like it operates almost like structural engineering.
Right, yeah. You want a clear answer.
Exactly. I mean, you fall off a ladder, you break your arm, and the X-ray shows that jagged, undeniable white line in the bone. And the doctor just points to the screen and says, well, there it is.
It's entirely binary. I mean, it's either broken or it isn't.
Yeah. And we crave that. We love systems where the dysfunction is totally visible and easily categorized. But when you step into the world of, say, neurodevelopment or complex trauma, suddenly that X-ray machine is, entirely useless.
It doesn't show you the problem at all.
No, not at all. You're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just murky, shifting, and deeply counterintuitive.
So you're forced to abandon those simple tools. You have to look at entirely different metrics to understand what's actually happening inside the system.
Right. And I've been thinking about that exact concept, that profound disorientation of looking at a complex system where all your old trusted diagnostic tools are failing you while I was preparing for today's deep dive.
Because the source material we're looking at today completely shatters our traditional X-ray of how a nation's economy is supposed to function.
Completely shatters it. We are jumping straight into a data set that is going to fundamentally rewire how you, listening right now, think about the future of global wealth.
Yeah, the premise we're unpacking challenges almost every single piece of standard macroeconomic logic that was drilled into us over the last, 50 years?
At least 50 years. So our foundation for this conversation is this massive, incredibly data-dense analytical report. It's titled The Paradox of Prosperity: Structural Evolution and Growth Resilience in the Post-Demographic Dividend Era.
Quite a mouthful.
It is, yeah. But this isn't just theoretical modeling. It's backed by this sprawling World Bank CSV dataset covering the financial, social, and demographic vital signs of entire swaths of the globe over decades.
And specifically, we're talking about regions of the world that are rapidly, undeniably aging.
Right. And the data presents us with a structural shift in human civilization that is happening right under our noses. It tracks countries that have crossed a very specific demographic threshold and, well, it measures how they survive.
But the word survive almost does a disservice to what's actually in this data set.
I agree, because the very first section of this report drops a statistical mystery that I literally had to reread 3 times. I just want to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding the decimal points.
It's a massive, glaring divergence in the data.
Yeah. When you look at these aging regions of the world, their annual GDP growth rate is fluctuating, and over the long term, it's clearly trending downwards.
Which, to be fair, aligns perfectly with traditional economic theory. I mean, the textbook assumption is that when a population gets older, you have fewer young workers entering the factories.
Right.
You have fewer people buying their first homes, less explosive consumption. So naturally, economic growth slows down. You expect the decline.
But then you look at the second line on the graph. Right next to that downward trending GDP growth rate, there's the metric for gross national income, or GNI, per capita.
The actual tangible wealth being generated and held per person.
Exactly. And that line isn't declining. It isn't even plateauing. It is consistently climbing, hitting unprecedented historic highs. The wealth is going completely off the charts.
It creates a total paradox. I mean, the graying of a nation has been treated by politicians and economists for decades as an impending apocalypse.
Like an economic death sentence.
Yes, exactly.
So the core question we're going to unravel today, the puzzle I want you, the listener, to hold in your mind as we navigate this data is this. Why is it that as the demographic burden gets visibly heavier, as a society gets older and supposedly more exhausted, the national wealth being created is actually breaking historical records?
How on earth has getting old become a ticket to absolute prosperity?
Right. And the thesis of the research gives us a profoundly counterintuitive answer.
It argues that these post-demographic dividend regions, these aging powerhouses, they aren't declining because they're aging. Instead, we're witnessing this invisible force, a complete structural metamorphosis that's entirely reshaping their economies from the molecular level up.
They aren't dying, they're evolving into a completely new kind of economic organism.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to break down exactly what that organism used to be so we can understand the mutation. Let's define the baseline. What exactly is a post-demographic dividend region, or a PST region, as the data categorizes it?
Well, to understand the post phase, we really have to look at the boom phase first.
Okay.
Historically, countries experience what economists call a demographic dividend. So imagine a society where Thanks to better medicine, infant mortality suddenly drops, but families are still having, 5 or 6 children. You get a massive population boom.
Right, a huge spike.
Yeah. And then a generation later, birth rates start to fall. But that massive boom generation is now in their 20s and 30s.
So you have this gigantic bulge of young, energetic, working-age people.
Exactly that. You have tens of millions of workers, but because birth rates have recently fallen, they have very few dependent children to feed. And because the previous generations were smaller, they have very few dependent elderly to care for.
Oh, wow. So it's like a sweet spot.
It is an economic golden era. Labor is infinitely abundant and therefore incredibly cheap.
This is the era of humming factories, exploding cities, massive infrastructure projects. I mean, the classic industrial boom we saw in the mid-20th century in the West and later in parts of Asia.
But that demographic dividend is biologically finite. It has a strict expiration date.
Right, because people get older.
Exactly. That massive bulge of young workers eventually ages into their 50s, 60s, and 70s. And because birth rates stayed low during their working years, there's no massive new generation coming up behind them to take their place on the assembly line.
So a PST region is basically a geographic area that has officially crossed that timeline.
Yes. They are dealing with the dual reality of an aging population and persistently low birth rates.
Which makes a specific data point in this report seem, honestly, entirely impossible at first glance. You have this society where the massive bulge of workers is retiring. The population is rapidly graying.
Right.
And yet the data shows that the total employment rate, when you look at every single person aged 15 and older, has remained remarkably stable at around 50% for years.
It's a fascinating metric.
But if a huge chunk of your population is moving into retirement age, how does a society keep half of its entire adult population active in the workforce? I mean, my initial assumption would be that the employment rate should be plummeting.
Well, the data suggests a massive quiet phenomenon called social mobilization.
Social mobilization?
Yeah, when the traditional labor pool of, say, 25 to 55-year-old men starts to shrink, the society becomes incredibly, almost ruthlessly efficient at keeping everyone else engaged.
So the nature of work itself changes.
Exactly. People are working differently. They're working much later into their lives, and entirely new demographics are being pulled into the formal economy to plug the leaks.
But even with that mobilization, the structural pressure is still building beneath the surface, right? The report has this incredibly vivid way of visualizing this pressure. They call it the scissors gap.
Oh, it's one of the most striking visualizations of societal tension I've seen in recent macroeconomic data.
Let me paint a picture of this graph for you listening. Imagine a standard chart with two lines that cross each other, looking exactly like the open blades of a pair of scissors.
It's a very clear visual.
One blade of those scissors represents the youth dependency ratio, so the financial and social burden of raising children. Over the decades in these PST regions, that line has plummeted dramatically.
Right, because of the low birth rate.
Yeah, it started up at 43.3% and has carved its way all the way down to about 24.6%. People are simply having far fewer kids.
And the other blade of the scissors is the elderly dependency ratio, the burden of caring for retirees. That line has climbed steadily, marching from 13.8% up to 17.5%, and the trajectory shows it continuing to push higher.
And right in the middle of this graph, those two lines intersect. The burden of the old overtakes the burden of the young.
When you take that graph off the page and put it into the real world, what does that intersection actually feel like? I mean, structurally, what is the difference between a society burdened by youth versus a society burdened by age?
Well, we have to zoom out and look at the history of human civilization. For thousands of years, the primary existential economic pressure of any family, village, or nation was raising the young.
Feeding them, schooling them, just keeping them alive to adulthood.
Exactly. And that pressure in these PST regions has fundamentally mutated into caring for the old. It's a complete 180-degree pivot in where a nation's capital, energy, and physical infrastructure are directed.
And raising a 5-year-old is a very different economic proposition than caring for an 85-year-old.
Fundamentally different. A child is, economically speaking, an investment with a guaranteed future return to the labor pool. You build schools, which are highly scalable. One teacher can educate 30 children.
Right, but caring for the elderly.
It requires increasingly bespoke, expensive, labor-intensive healthcare. You cannot have one nurse care for 30 intensive care patients.
No, absolutely not.
It requires complex Social Security support without the expectation that those individuals will return to the formal physical labor pool. This puts compounding, unprecedented strain on a nation's fiscal systems.
I need to play devil's advocate here, though, because the math feels like it should lead to collapse.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's look at this through the lens of a single company. If I run a massive corporation and over 20 years I lose all of my cheap, energetic junior staff and I'm left entirely with expensive, aging executives who are about to retire and draw massive pensions.
Your company goes bankrupt.
Exactly. It folds under the weight of its own top-heavy structure. So why doesn't a country? If the burden is shifting to an incredibly expensive demographic, why aren't these PST regions defaulting and collapsing into poverty?
That corporate analogy is compelling, but it overlooks a crucial mechanism that nations possess and static businesses do not. It's the ability to fundamentally mutate the intrinsic quality of their human assets.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, a country doesn't just lose its junior staff and keep the exact same business model. The staff that remains, the duration of their usefulness, and the actual nature of the work they do entirely transforms.
Oh, I see.
To understand how they avoid bankruptcy, we have to look at what the research terms survival resilience. And this resilience is powered by invisible dividends.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the first of those invisible dividends deals with longevity. But not just the grim reality of getting older that we usually picture. It's about getting older better.
The leaps in life expectancy in this data set are just staggering. Female life expectancy at birth in these regions rose from 79.2 years to 83.6 years.
And the men are experiencing a massive catch-up effect, too. Male life expectancy jumped from 66.0 years to 78.1 years.
So the historical gender gap in lifespan is actively narrowing.
Yeah, that narrowing gap is a profound testament to systemic advancements. I mean, think about what used to kill men at 66 in the mid-20th century.
Heavy industry hazards, right?
Exactly. Occupational hazards, rampant cardiovascular disease, and lifestyle factors like high smoking rates. As the economy shifts and as public health and chronic disease management become incredibly sophisticated, that male mortality rate plummets.
But the statistic that made me stop and actually recalculate my own assumptions was the 65-year survival rate.
Oh, the survival rate is wild.
In these PST regions, the statistical probability of a woman surviving to age 65 is over 91%. For men, it's over 84%.
Surviving to traditional retirement age is no longer a coin toss or a stroke of genetic luck. It is the overwhelming, undeniable, statistical norm.
And what's fascinating here is the societal framing of those extra years. This is where our traditional economic models completely fail us.
How so?
We're deeply conditioned to view any years lived past 65 purely through the lens of a deficit. We picture hospital beds, pension payouts, economic drain, but the data reveals a completely different biological and economic reality.
Because of the healthcare infrastructure.
Right. Because of this sophisticated infrastructure, a massive percentage of these extended lifespans are highly active, healthy years.
So a 65-year-old today essentially possesses the biological age and vitality of a 50-year-old from a century ago.
Precisely. So the economic question becomes, what does a massive demographic of healthy, active 65 to 80-year-olds actually do?
Well, they consume.
Exactly. The creation of the silver economy is a gargantuan driver of GDP. They travel, they purchase specialized lifestyle services, they remodel their homes for long-term accessibility.
And furthermore, they provide a massive reservoir of what we might call wisdom capital.
Meaning they're contributing to the economy without necessarily clocking into a factory.
Yes. Think about the childcare infrastructure. Millions of grandparents providing reliable childcare is the exact mechanism that allows young parents to rapidly return to the workforce.
Oh, that's a huge point.
And increasingly, these older individuals are actively continuing to participate in the formal economy. They become specialized consultants, they mentor, they start small businesses in the gig economy.
So it's a massive pool of latent economic energy that previous generations simply did not possess. They aren't just sitting in a rocking chair draining the ledger. They're actively spinning the wheels of the economy. Just, in a completely different sector than a 25-year-old industrial worker would.
Right. However, even if you factor in the massive economic engine of the silver economy, you still face a stark mathematical deficit of young, male, blue-collar labor.
The exact labor that historically drove the initial demographic dividend.
Exactly. So offset that massive loss, these PST regions had to structurally reorganize themselves to unleash their ultimate secret weapon.
The gender dividend. This part of the dataset is phenomenal. To fill the gaping void left by a shrinking young male workforce, PST regions systematically mobilized women.
The sheer volume shows female labor force participation rising from 42.3% to 46.1%.
But the most crucial element here isn't just the quantity of women entering the workforce, it's the staggering quality of their human capital.
This is the distinction that separates a collapsing economy from a mutating one. It was never about women stepping onto the low-skill assembly lines that the men were aging out of. That wasn't the play at all.
Not at all.
Yeah.
The data explicitly highlights that these women entering the workforce possess an incredibly high rate of what they classify as advanced education.
They're arriving in the labor market armed with university degrees, hyper-specialized skills, and advanced professional certifications.
They stepped in to act as the ultimate balancers of the labor market. As the old, muscle-driven industrial economy started to suffocate from a lack of young men, a completely new, brain-driven knowledge economy was waiting in the wings.
And this highly educated influx of women provided the exact high-octane fuel that this new economy required to ignite.
I want you to think about your own workplace for a second, wherever you are listening to this. Think about the strategy meetings you sit in, the digital projects you manage, the complex systems you interact with daily.
Yeah.
How much of our modern, knowledge-based economy is completely held together by highly educated women taking on roles like data scientists, UX researchers, compliance officers, digital marketing strategists, roles that literally did not exist a generation or two ago?
It represents an absolute paradigm shift in human capital. The society successfully replaced a workforce whose primary tradable value was physical endurance with a workforce whose primary value is cognitive agility and specialized knowledge synthesis.
So if we take a step back and look at the entire board, the PST region has fundamentally mutated from its boom-era form.
Right.
It now operates with an older, much healthier population, driving a massive, specialized consumption economy, and a highly educated, far more gender-balanced workforce, driving the high-end production side.
Which logically leads us to the ultimate question of output. With this completely transformed, older, highly educated workforce, what does their actual economic engine produce?
Because we still have to reconcile the paradox we established at the beginning.
Exactly. Their annual GDP growth rate is falling, but their individual wealth is skyrocketing. How do the physics of that math actually work?
Let's dive into the core of that economic illusion. The report puts a massive spotlight on the GDP growth rate, specifically focusing on what they term a speed bump.
And if you just look at the raw percentages out of context, it looks genuinely terrifying.
During the boom years, the height of the demographic dividend, annual GDP growth in these regions used to hit peaks of around 6.3%. Today, in recent years, it's hovering around a mere 1-point-something%.
If you're a traditional investor trained in the 1990s, you see growth drop from over 6% to 1%, and you assume the sky is falling.
The panic is visceral, but it is fundamentally misplaced. And this is where basic economic literacy is so crucial to understanding the future. The research explains this phenomenon through the base effect.
I really want to pull apart the space effect because it is the Rosetta Stone for understanding why these aging countries are so incredibly wealthy despite slowing down.
I'll lay out the mathematics. Think of a percentage simply as a slice of a pie. In the past, during those explosive 6.3% boom years, the total economic pie, the total absolute GDP of these combined regions, was roughly around $1 trillion.
Okay.
So 6% growth on a $1 trillion base means they were adding about $60 billion of brand new wealth to the global economy that year.
$60 billion, a massive society-altering amount of money at the time, a phenomenal year of growth.
But fast forward to the present day. After decades of that compounding growth, that total GDP pie is no longer $1 trillion. It has swelled into a staggering, almost incomprehensible $50 trillion economy.
Wait, 50 trillion? The scale of that is hard to even picture.
Exactly. So today, when the economic growth rate is only 1%, you're taking 1% of $50 trillion. Mathematically, that equals $500 billion of brand new wealth being added to the economy in a single year.
Okay, that completely reframes the narrative.
Right. The speed of the growth has drastically slowed down from 6% to 1%, but the actual physical volume of wealth being dumped into the system every single year is astronomically larger.
We're talking about $500 billion of new value today versus $60 billion of new value during the boom years.
I love trying to visualize this. It's like, imagine you have a teenager running a neighborhood lemonade stand. They invest $10 in lemons and sugar, and by the end of the summer, they have $11. That's a 10% return on investment.
A huge double-digit growth rate.
Yeah. Meanwhile, down the street, you have a massive institutional mutual fund managing billions of dollars, and they have a sluggish year, returning a meager 1%. The teenager's lemonade stand had a growth rate 10 times higher than the mutual fund.
But the mutual fund generated tens of millions of actual dollars, while the kid made a single buck.
That analogy perfectly captures the illusion. A PST region is no longer a nimble, fast-growing lemonade stand. It has evolved into a mature, gargantuan mutual fund. The percentage rate is smaller solely because the denominator, the base wealth of the society, is so incredibly vast.
This is the exact mechanism that explains why GNI per capita continues to hit historic highs even as the growth percentage drops. There's simply a massive amount of new pie being generated, even if the edges of the pie are expanding more slowly.
But the pie isn't just bigger. The flavor, the ingredients, the entire recipe has changed. Because we established that they lost their massive pool of young industrial labor.
Right.
So if they aren't working in the steel mills and factories that drove the 6% boom years, what are they actually doing to generate that $500 billion of new wealth every year?
They're executing the ultimate industrial shift. The data tracks the profound deindustrialization of the PST regions.
And the numbers are stark. Industrial employment dropped from 30.3% down to 25.6%.
Now, in standard political rhetoric, we hear deindustrialization framed exclusively as a national tragedy.
Yeah, we constantly hear stories about the Rust Belt, the hollowed-out factory towns, the loss of national greatness and self-sufficiency. And, we're not taking a political stance here, just looking at the raw economic data.
Exactly. It's a narrative that's heavily weaponized in domestic politics on all sides. And while the localized pain of a closed factory is very real, the macroeconomic data tells a completely different overarching story.
It argues that for a PST region, deindustrialization isn't a symptom of failure. It is the final necessary evolution of a mature economy.
You literally have to shed low-value industrial labor because you simply do not have the cheap, young bodies required to sustain it. If you try to compete on cheap manufacturing, you will bankrupt your society.
So if the industrial floor drops out, what catches the economy?
The service sector. And it didn't just catch the fall, it absolutely exploded, becoming the new, unshakable foundation of national wealth.
There is a specific column in the CSV data here that I found completely fascinating. We already discussed women entering the workforce, heavily skewing towards services, but look at the men.
Oh, the shift for men is incredible.
For men specifically, employment in the service sector rose from 54.1% to an overwhelming 66.6%. Two-thirds of all working men in these aging regions are now employed in services.
This data point shatters our cultural stereotype of the working-class male. The archetype of the PSP worker is no longer a guy in a hard hat carrying a metal lunch pail into a steel mill. The modern male worker is a guy in business casual, working in global logistics, in financial technology, in healthcare administration, in software development, or in specialized B2B consulting.
The hard hat has been entirely replaced by the headset, the spreadsheet, and the cloud architecture.
Services are now the absolute bedrock of the PST economy because services are where the high profit margins live, and they're the only place where you can generate massive scalable wealth without requiring millions of young people performing physical, back-breaking labor.
But there's a catch to that. A high-end service economy, a $50 trillion mutual fund economy, cannot survive on low-skill labor.
Right.
You can't run a global fintech hub or a massive logistics network with a workforce that only has an 8th-grade education. It requires a fundamental society-wide rewiring of the human brain. Which brings us to the new arsenal these countries are building.
They're shifting their entire societal focus from scale to depth.
The data on education reveals the true superpower of the PST region. The core competitiveness of these aging countries on the global stage is no longer about having the most labor. It's about engineering the highest density of educated minds on the planet.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, they intentionally traded the demographic dividend for the talent dividend.
Just listen to these enrollment numbers. Pre-primary enrollment is over 75.9%. Secondary education, meaning high school, is over 90%. That is essentially universal coverage.
And the university numbers.
But the statistic that truly illustrates the mutation is tertiary education. College, university, advanced technical institutes. The enrollment rate in these regions is a staggering 80.2%.
We really need to pause and let the magnitude of that number sink in. 8 out of every 10 people in these societies are receiving some form of advanced higher education.
8 out of 10. That's insane.
If you look at the history of education, for centuries, university was an elite sorting mechanism. It was explicitly designed for the top 5 or 10% of the population to become doctors, lawyers, theologians, and civil leaders.
It was a luxury of the aristocracy, or the exceptionally gifted.
But in a PST region, higher education has been completely stripped of its luxury status. It's now the absolute baseline infrastructure required for national survival.
Right.
When you have an aging population, your domestic labor costs skyrocket. You cannot compete globally on making cheap plastic toys or assembling basic consumer electronics. You will be undercut and destroyed by younger emerging markets every single time.
Because their labor is inherently cheaper. You can't beat a 20-year-old worker's wages in an emerging market with a 50-year-old worker's wages in a PST region.
Precisely. So how does the wealthy, aging country survive? You automate the cheap, repetitive jobs, and you elevate your human workers to perform cognitive tasks that cannot be easily replicated by cheaper labor abroad.
You don't need 10 factory workers pulling manual levers if you have one highly educated software engineer who can write a script to automate those 10 levers, and another engineer who can design the robotics.
The talent dividend is entirely about the hyperdensity of specialized knowledge.
And this directly dictates their global export strategy. Facing incredibly high domestic labor costs, how do PST regions maintain their geopolitical and economic power?
By making sure that the physical things they do still manufacture are incredibly complex and incredibly expensive.
It is a high-tech survival strategy. The dataset shows that between 20 to 25% of all manufactured exports from these regions are classified as high-tech.
We're talking about advanced aerospace components, cutting-edge pharmaceuticals, precision optics, and semiconductors.
This strategy culminates in a massive $2.2 trillion high-tech export market.
$2.2 trillion. They are quite literally exporting the physical byproducts of that 80.2% tertiary education rate.
The mechanics of this make total sense when you think about it. I was trying to come up with an analogy for this pivot. Imagine a beloved, family-run neighborhood restaurant that's been around for 40 years.
Okay, I'm tracking.
In the beginning, rent in the neighborhood was dirt cheap, ingredients were cheap, and they survived by selling $2 burgers to 1 million people a year. It was a pure volume game.
That represents the demographic dividend phase. Cheap inputs, massive volume.
But over the decades, the neighborhood gets heavily gentrified. Rent skyrockets to astronomical levels, the local minimum wage goes up, and high-quality ingredients are expensive.
Right.
The restaurant realizes it physically can no longer afford to sell $2 burgers. If they try to maintain the volume game, the overhead will bankrupt them. So what do?
They execute a massive pivot.
Exactly. They hire a Michelin star chef, they completely redesign the interior and the menu, and they transition to selling $200 highly complex tasting menus to 10,000 people a year.
They survive the gentrification of their own economy by exporting a deeply knowledge-intensive product to a smaller, much wealthier clientele.
Yes. They realize they can't do volume anymore, so they transition entirely to margin. PST regions are the $200 tasting menu of the global economy.
It's a brilliant, necessary pivot. But, as with any massive structural shift in human history, it introduces new, highly complex problems.
Which brings us to a really fascinating historical tension in the data. High-tech manufacturing, massive service sectors, extreme wealth, high consumption. Historically, since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, what does all of that intense economic activity inevitably generate?
Smog, pollution, environmental degradation. The unbreakable rule of industrialization since the 1800s has been the richer a country gets, the more energy it burns, the more it consumes, and the more carbon it pumps into the atmosphere.
Wealth basically equaled pollution.
Exactly.
Which makes the data on environmental load so surprising. The report asks a profound question. When a PST region reaches this level of mature wealth, does it continue to get dirtier, or does it somehow get cleaner?
For decades, the assumption was always dirtier. But the data site highlights a trend that is honestly a beacon of hope for the global climate crisis. It's the decoupling line chart.
We established earlier with the mutual fund analogy that the total GDP of these regions has grown massively, swelling to $50 trillion.
Right.
But while that wealth line went up, the GDP carbon intensity line, which is a metric measuring exactly how many kilograms of CO2 are emitted to produce a single dollar of GDP, that line plummeted. It dropped from 0.6 all the way down to 0.14.
That divergence is what economists call decoupling. Economic growth and carbon emissions have officially broken their historical two-century-old link in these regions.
It provides empirical proof that sustainable growth isn't just some utopian fantasy or a talking point in a climate think tank white paper. It is a structural, mathematical reality happening right now in PST regions.
And it is vital to understand why this decoupling is occurring. It's not magic, and it's not just good intentions. It's a direct mechanical result of everything we just talked about.
Right, because of the shift in labor.
Exactly. When your economy shifts from smelting heavy steel to processing digital finance and writing software, your domestic carbon footprint naturally shrinks.
And furthermore, when your population is highly educated, they demand cleaner urban environments, and crucially, they possess the technological know-how to actually build them.
Which is perfectly reflected in the energy infrastructure data, the renewable surge. The data shows renewable energy consumption in these areas growing from 6.3% to 8.7% of total use.
But the specific statistic that jumped off the page for me was non-hydro renewable electricity production, meaning wind, solar, and geothermal power. That sector leaped from a tiny 1.1% to massive new heights.
They're in the process of entirely rewiring their national electrical grids.
I do want to push back on the motivation here, though. When we see this green surge, is this really driven by raw economics? Or is this just highly wealthy countries feeling a sense of historical guilt about their past emissions and spending their massive surplus wealth on green projects to save the polar bears?
Like an environmental charity.
Yeah, exactly. Is it charity or is it a calculated business plan?
That's a very common and very valid skepticism. But the macroeconomic data is clear. It is raw, calculating, long-term economics. Think back to the $200 tasting menu analogy.
The high-tech export strategy.
Exactly. Green technology is the ultimate knowledge-intensive industry of the 21st century. Designing next-generation solar cells that are 2% more efficient, optimizing the aerodynamics of offshore wind turbines, engineering grid-scale battery storage. These are incredibly complex problems.
They require massive armies of those highly educated scientists and engineers we talked about.
Yes. By aggressively dominating the renewable energy transition domestically, PST countries are artificially creating the exact high-tech export markets they need to survive globally tomorrow.
Oh, that makes total sense. So it's not just about cleaning up the smog in their own backyard. It's about inventing the most efficient mop in the world, patenting that mop, and then selling that mop at a premium to the rest of the world.
It's a self-preservation strategy. Green growth is not a charity project. It is their core thesis for future economic supremacy. If they can pioneer and monopolize zero-carbon technology, they can sell it to the younger, emerging markets that are still rapidly industrializing, thereby securing their own economic dominance for the next century.
Okay, let's take a breath and survey the landscape we've just described. We have painted a picture of a society that is immensely wealthy, highly educated, gender-balanced, rapidly transitioning to green energy, and producing high-tech miracles.
It sounds like an absolute frictionless utopia.
It really does. But no economic transition of this violent magnitude happens without leaving deep societal scars. And that brings us to the hidden cracks in the foundation.
Right.
Because when you dig past the macro wealth indicators into the later pages of this data set, you start to see the very real, the very human shadows cast by all this prosperity.
The first major fault line appears right in the middle of their greatest achievement, the labor and education market.
We established that 80% of people are getting tertiary education. In the old world, you'd think a college degree is a golden ticket, a perfect, impenetrable shield against poverty and unemployment.
And to some extent, the data confirms it works. Unemployment for people with only a basic education is relatively high, hovering around 9.9%. But for those who achieve that tertiary education, the unemployment rate drops significantly to around 4.0%.
The degree still functions as a sorting mechanism. It generally places you into the employed class.
But there is a massive glaring warning sign flashing red in the youth data. It's the youth NEET rate.
NEET. That stands for not in education, employment, or training.
Yes. This is the percentage of young people who are completely, entirely disconnected from the system. They aren't sitting in a classroom, they don't have a job, and they aren't learning a vocational trade. They're just sitting out.
And in these highly educated, incredibly wealthy PST regions, that NEET rate is stubbornly hovering around 10%.
It's alarming.
I really struggle to visualize that. How can 1 in 10 young people be completely sidelined, essentially invisible, in an economy that we just said is desperate for high-level cognitive talent.
Right.
What does a 10% NEET rate actually look like in a society?
Well, it manifests as a profound, quiet crisis. You see sociological phenomena emerging, like the hikikomori in Japan or the lying flat movement in other highly competitive Asian and Western economies. It represents a massive latent risk to social stability.
Wow.
Think about the psychological mechanics of what causes it. When 80% of your entire society gets a university degree, the baseline expectation of what life should look like changes for the youth.
They were promised a specific social contract, right?
Exactly. Study hard, get a degree, and you'll be rewarded with a prestigious, high-paying, intellectually stimulating knowledge job.
Because nobody grinds through a master's degree in engineering or sociology with the life goal of working the cash register at a fast food joint.
But then the reality of the math hits them. The economy, even a massive $50 trillion high-tech service economy, does not consist entirely of CEO positions, lead architect roles, and senior data scientists. There's massive degree inflation.
So they graduate with high expectations, only to realize that the elite jobs are fiercely competitive.
Or worse, they're already occupied by the older generations who are living to 85 and refusing to retire. So, faced with the prospect of taking lower status jobs that don't match their educational pedigree, they experience a profound disconnect.
So rather than participate in a game where the rules feel rigged against them, they just withdraw. They opt out of the rat race entirely.
Yes. And that withdrawal is a tragic economic loss of potential, but more importantly, it is a devastating psychological loss, which leads directly into the next shadow of prosperity the data tracks: public health and safety.
This part of the dataset was incredibly sobering to read. It shows that when a society gets incredibly wealthy, it gets exceptionally good at solving physical, tangible threats.
Right.
The data shows that road traffic deaths have plummeted across PST regions. That is a testament to incredible civil engineering. We built better guardrails, instituted strict safety regulations, designed cars with crumple zones, and funded world-class trauma centers. We successfully engineered the danger out of the physical roads.
Physical safety is a problem that immense wealth and high-level engineering can solve relatively easily. You can essentially buy safer roads.
But then you look at the suicide rates. Despite all the wealth, all the education, and all the physical safety, the data shows only an agonizingly slow decline in suicides, sitting at a persistent baseline of around 14.6 per 100,000 people.
The divergence between physical engineering and psychological engineering is heartbreaking. This raises an important question. These high-income societies have almost entirely insulated their citizens from physical threats, but they are struggling immensely to manage complex psychological health.
It proves that while wealth can buy physical safety, it absolutely does not buy mental peace. In fact, you could argue the structure of the wealth is causing the distress.
The data strongly suggests that. The intense, relentless competition of a knowledge-based economy, the profound social isolation of modern screen-based urban living, and the crushing pressure of those high expectations we just talked about, these factors can actually exacerbate mental health crises.
A PST region is a place where you're highly unlikely to die in a car crash, but it can be a psychologically grueling environment to navigate daily.
It's the pressure cooker of the $200 case menu. If your entire society is built on exporting elite, high-margin cognitive work, everyone is expected to be exceptional all the time.
And human beings aren't built to be exceptional all the time.
No, they're not. It takes a massive toll. And while these societies manage their internal psychological vulnerabilities, they also have to manage a massive external vulnerability. Which brings us to the final piece of the structural puzzle: the global trade web.
Right, because these PST regions don't exist in a vacuum. They are deeply tethered to the rest of the planet. The data shows that overall goods trade remains a very stable chunk of their economy, hovering right around 47% of GDP.
But the really interesting part is the direction of that trade. It is shifting dramatically.
In the past, the data shows that exports between high-income economies, meaning rich countries selling their products primarily to other rich countries, made up a massive 86% of their trade.
But recently, that number has dropped down to 73.2%. A huge chunk of their trade is moving.
Where did it go?
If we look at the geopolitical map, it shows that PST regions are quietly, methodically decentralizing their risk. They are redirecting their high-tech products, their green technology, and their advanced services away from each other, and aggressively targeting emerging markets.
They're actively hunting for new, younger customers.
It's much deeper than just finding customers. They are intentionally intertwining their aging, top-heavy economies with younger, rapidly growing global populations.
Think about the symbiosis of that.
Exactly. If your domestic population is aging, they are consuming healthcare and leisure, but they aren't buying millions of new cars or building millions of new starter homes. You need to sell your advanced software, your wind turbine patents, and your complex financial services to countries that are still physically building their infrastructure and expanding a young middle class.
It's a fascinating symbiotic relationship. The aging, highly educated brain of the PST region needs the youthful, industrial muscle of the emerging market to actually buy and implement its ideas.
They're actively hedging against their own demographic decline by tapping into the demographic dividend of the rest of the world. It's a brilliant, necessary balancing act.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a massive amount of conceptual ground today. This data fundamentally dismantles the doom and gloom narrative that we constantly hear about aging societies.
It really does.
Let's do a grand summary of the absolute pillars of the PST future based on everything we've unpacked.
I would boil it down to three undeniable pillars. Pillar number one, the era of the demographic dividend is dead, but the talent dividend is the new king. Future survival does not require having the most people, it requires having the smartest, most adaptable people. That 80% higher education rate is the absolute engine of their ongoing wealth.
Pillar number two, the industrial age is over for these regions. Services are the absolute bedrock of the economy. The physical factories are shrinking, while the digital networks, the research labs, and the corporate offices are expanding. Both male and female labor forces are now heavily concentrated in high-value cognitive services.
And pillar number three, the transition to green, low-carbon technology is not an environmental charity project. The empirical decoupling of GDP and carbon emissions proves that sustainable growth is possible, and the massive investment in renewables proves it's their calculated path for future high-tech export dominance.
It really reframes the way you look at the globe. These PST regions, these older, grayer, supposedly tired countries, they aren't dying. They're actually the frontier of human economic evolution.
They're running a grand, real-time, high-stakes experiment on the quality of growth rather than just relying on the brute force quantity of growth. Their successes and their hidden cracks are serving as a lighthouse. They're navigating the treacherous rocks first, lighting the way for every other nation on Earth that will eventually, inevitably, grow old.
Which brings me to the final thought I want to leave you with today. Something for you to genuinely mull over on your commute, or while you finish your coffee, or while you're sitting at your desk in the service economy.
What's the thought?
Well, we just established that right now, these aging, incredibly wealthy PST regions are surviving and hitting record wealth by exporting their high-tech services and green innovations to younger, emerging markets. They're perfectly balancing the global scales. The old brain relies on the young muscle.
It is a delicate, perfectly timed equilibrium.
But what happens in 50 years? Because demographics are destiny, eventually birth rates will fall in those emerging markets too. They're going to cross that exact same threshold and become post-demographic dividend regions themselves.
Oh, wow.
So I want you to imagine a future where the entire globe is aging, when every single country on Earth is highly educated, when every nation is running a high-end service-based economy, and everyone is trying to sell $200 tasting menus. Who is left to buy the services? And more importantly, who is left to actually build the physical world?
That is the ultimate paradox of prosperity, a question that economics hasn't answered yet.
Think about that one today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the data. Keep asking those big questions, keep looking past the obvious narratives, and we'll see you next time.